Hi, my name is Kathryn Laughlin, and welcome to the Laughlin Light. I'm starting this podcast because I can see that some of our God-given rights are being infringed upon by three groups in this country: the big news media, big tech, and the political class. I feel that it's very important for us to take every opportunity that we have to express our freedom of speech and to protect that as much as possible. So we're here today to talk about the history of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and take a look at how the narrative in our country is converse to the history of the Democratic Party, and how they've essentially flipped history on its back. So let's take a look at the start here. How did the Democrat Party come to be? Well, it all started as the Democratic Republican Party, which was one party that split into two. So let's take a look at the beginnings of the Democratic Party. Well, first we had the Democratic Republican Party, which split into two parties. One side was pro-slavery and one side was anti-slavery. The pro-slavery side were the Democrats, and it was founded by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a slave owner himself. He owned hundreds of slaves. He treated his slaves very poorly and felt that they were an inferior race. Andrew Jackson also infringed upon all rights of the Native American group in this country, violated all treaties, all agreements, and felt that they were savage, inferior, and that they needed to disappear. So he took all of their land, sold it to white settlers for pennies on the dollar, or just gave it away for free in hopes that the Native Americans would disappear. At the same time, we have the Republican Party coming to form and was founded by Abraham Lincoln. Now, many Americans would associate Abraham Lincoln with the Democrats. But in fact, Abraham Lincoln founded the Republican Party as an opposition to slavery and as an opposition to the spread of slavery in the American colonies, in the American territories. So the idea that slavery was somehow this battle between the North and South initially is completely false. Slavery was a war between pro-slavery Democrats and anti-slavery Republicans. And in fact, if we look at history, at the time of the Civil War, Republicans owned 0 slaves. Democrats owned 100% of the slaves here in this country. In the North, in the South, in all of the American territories, Democrats owned 100% of slaves in the United States, and they continuously fought against the movement to give rights and freedom to slaves. So, enter into the 1860s. Exactly 100 years before our modern-day civil rights movement of the 1960s, we had the very first civil rights movement in this country in the 1860s. The Republicans led this movement. The Republicans fought for the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, all three of which gave equal treatment of slaves, gave voting rights to slaves, and gave citizenship to slaves in the United States. And if we look at the congressional archives, we can clearly see who voted for and who voted against these rights. And we can see that in almost every case, 100% of Republicans voted for these amendments, and 100% of Democrats voted against these amendments. So, ironically enough, in the 1860s, when the Republicans were fighting for the freedom of slaves, for voting rights, for equality for Africans in the United States, we have the Ku Klux Klan come into power in 1865 by none other than a Democrat, Nathan Forrest, who actually served 2 terms in Memphis as a Democratic representative. Nathan also became one of the wealthiest men in all of Tennessee, amassed a great fortune while in power in politics in the Democrat Party. So we effectively had 2 civil rights movements in this country, in the 1860s and then 100 years later in the 1960s. And you may be asking yourself, well, what exactly did the Democrats offer in terms of civil rights or freedom or voting rights or citizenship? All of the things that they talk about today in terms of immigration. Okay, so they want citizenship for all of these people. They want voting rights. They feel that Republicans oppress voting rights and freedom of speech and all of these things for people in this country. In fact, the Democrats only ever offered the longest filibuster to ever take place in American history, which was 74 days. They filibustered in 1964 because they did not want to pass the Civil Rights Act. And we can see voting records along those lines as well, seeing that the majority of Democrats voted against the Civil Rights Act. In addition to civil rights in the United States, we can also see that many of the suffragettes were Republicans as well. So women's rights to votes in the United States were also founded in the Republican Party. And the Republican National Convention was the first time women were ever allowed to sit in seats or on boards or on committees of any kind related to politics, and that was in the Republican Convention. Now, speaking of women's rights, one of the great champions of women's rights in this country is our friend Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is on record saying how Margaret Sanger led a wonderful life and should be seen as a role model for all women, as Hillary herself sees Margaret Sanger as a role model. What many people don't know is that Margaret Sanger was the leader of the Negro Project. Imagine Hillary Clinton using those words today. The Negro Project was a partnership with the wives of the Ku Klux Klan, and what their whole goal was to eliminate the black race from the United States, and the only moral way to do that is to eliminate them before they're born so they don't have to suffer. So what do we see here today in America? We see Planned Parenthoods cropping up in minority neighborhoods. It's been that way since Margaret Sanger enacted her plan with the women of the Ku Klux Klan, and frankly with the support of the Democrat Party, to eliminate black babies in America. So where better to start than in these black communities? So with all of this being said about the Democratic Party and how they participated in slavery, in eliminating the Native American culture in the United States, in the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, in the founding of Planned Parenthood, and the extermination of over 30 million black babies in this country, with all of that being said, what conclusion do we come to? Now, knowing this information, well, the conclusion that I come to is that the Democratic Party has been racist from the start. The Democratic Party spreads a narrative accusing the other side, the Republican Party, of doing exactly what they've done themselves. And that, my friends, is something called fascism, which we'll get into another day. It's been done before. It's an old playbook. We're not surprised by this. But it is happening in this country, in the United States. And the rate at which it's perpetuating is scary. So just please be mindful when you hear narratives, when you hear celebrities, when you hear politicians talking and asking for votes and asking for money. Be mindful the next time you're sitting in an election booth who you're voting for. Take into account the historical context of the Democratic Party. So please keep in mind when you hear these politicians, like our very own Pennsylvania Secretary of State, Kathy Bachvar, talking about how she's inspired by the Democrats leading in voting right efforts and freeing of the slaves and, freeing of people in our society. Keep in mind when you hear these people say these things that it is simply not true. We have history. We have documented history. We know what has happened in American history. And please, don't let history repeat itself. So this was our first episode of the Laughlin Light. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, share, subscribe, message me, share any comments you may have. I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you all, and God bless.